Imagine a Hollywood where the rules didn't exist, where monsters roamed, mad doctors schemed, and filmmakers dared to show audiences what censors later erased. Before the Hays Code slammed its iron grip on cinema, there was a brief window when horror films went too far. These weren't just scary, they were scandalous. Tonight, we're uncovering 12 pre-code horror films so daring they shocked audiences and terrified Hollywood itself. Freaks, 1932. When Todd Browning's Freaks premiered, MGM expected another gothic horror in the style of Dracula. Instead, they got a film so disturbing it was banned for decades. The story centers on circus performers, many with real physical deformities, who are mocked by a trapeze artist until they take shocking revenge. Unlike other films, Freaks didn't rely on costumes or makeup. Its terror came from reality. Audiences fainted. MGM executives panicked. Preview screenings were disastrous, with some reports of patrons vomiting in the aisles. The film was cut to shreds. Nearly 30 minutes of footage vanished. Britain banned it for 30 years. Even MGM's own studio head distanced himself, embarrassed by what had been unleashed. Behind the scenes, Browning was haunted by the fallout. Once a celebrated director, his career never recovered. He was branded too grotesque for Hollywood. But whispers lingered. Was Freaks truly exploitative, or was it a radical plea for empathy, showing humanity in those society labeled as monsters? For years, the film disappeared into obscurity, screened only in seedy midnight theaters. Then the counterculture of the 1960s rediscovered it. Suddenly, the same film once considered dangerous was hailed as a masterpiece. Critics reframed it as a dark parable about cruelty and community. The final chilling chant, "One of us, one of us," still echoes as both a threat and an invitation. Freaks forced audiences to confront their own fear of difference, and that perhaps was its true horror. Murders in the Rue Morgue, 1932. Universal hoped to strike gold again after the success of Dracula. They cast Bela Lugosi as a deranged scientist in Murders in the Rue Morgue, loosely adapted from Edgar Allan Poe. But instead of Gothic castles, the horror here was more uncomfortably modern. Abduction, forced experiments, and scenes dripping with sadistic undertones. Lugosi plays Dr. Miraclo, a madman who kidnaps women to inject them with ape blood in his quest to prove Darwinian evolution. The film shows bound victims, screams echoing as Miracle's sinister experiments unfold. It was far more graphic than audiences were used to, and censors quickly took notice. Several states demanded cuts. Some European countries banned it outright for its grotesque imagery and its supposed attack on morality. Production itself was troubled. Director Robert Florey clashed with Universal executives who forced edits to tone down the darkest scenes. Still, what remained was enough to rattle audiences. Reviews at the time called it repellent and repugnant, and the film underperformed. Lugosi, once riding high as Dracula, began to slide into a career of typecasting as madmen and villains. For decades, the film was dismissed as a failed experiment. Yet modern scholars have reappraised it, noting how its themes anticipated the later horror fixation on science gone wrong. The image of Lugosi leering over helpless women became iconic in horror history. Though forgotten by many, Murders in the Rue Morgue lingers like a half-remembered nightmare, proof that horror didn't need castles and cloaks. Sometimes the terror was clinical, and all too human. Island of Lost Souls, 1932. Island of Lost Souls was Paramount's bold attempt to adapt H.G. Wells' The Island of Dr. Moreau. The result? A film so disturbing it was banned in Britain until the 1950s. Its mix of animal-human hybrids, cruel experiments, and moral ambiguity pushed horror to new extremes. Charles Laughton stars as Dr. Moreau, a scientist who rules a remote island where beasts are surgically transformed into near humans. The chilling scenes of creatures writhing in pain, along with Moreau's infamous House of Pain, horrified audiences. And then came the shocking line from a desperate hybrid. "Are we not men?" That question became both a catchphrase and a philosophical nightmare. Censors bristled. The British Board of Film Censors refused to approve it. Even in America, critics labeled it indecent and bestial. Rumors swirled that animal cruelty had actually occurred on set, a charge never proven but endlessly whispered. Behind the camera, Paramount executives worried they'd gone too far. Welles himself denounced the adaptation, furious at its grotesque tone. Yet Charles Laughton's performance was unforgettable, sinister, charming, and unnervingly polite as he presided over horror. His portrayal influenced generations of mad scientists on screen. The film's legacy grew quietly. In the 1970s, it was rediscovered by cult audiences who saw its themes as metaphors for unchecked science and authoritarian cruelty. It even inspired the band Devo, whose chant, "Are we not men? We are Devo," came straight from Moreau's tortured creations. Island of Lost Souls survives as a relic of a time when horror dared to blur the line between man and monster, and forced audiences to question which side they were truly on. White Zombie, 1932. When White Zombie premiered, it was marketed as the first zombie movie ever made. Starring Bela Lugosi as the sinister voodoo master Murder Legendre, it told the story of a young bride lured into a trap, turned into a lifeless puppet under his control. At the time, audiences had never seen the idea of The Walking Dead presented in such stark, hypnotic detail. Shot quickly on a shoestring budget, the film made use of leftover sets from bigger productions like Dracula and Frankenstein. That gave it an eerie, mismatched look, decayed castles, and ghostly plantations that felt both cheap and dreamlike. Critics dismissed it as sensationalist trash, but audiences were rattled by its atmosphere. The sight of blank-eyed zombies, not monsters, but enslaved humans robbed of free will, hit a cultural nerve during the Great Depression. Censors bristled not only at the occult themes, but also at its thinly veiled commentary on slavery and power. Whispered rumors claimed it glamorized forbidden practices and should never have reached the screen. In some states, local censorship boards demanded edits, though the studio resisted, seeing controversy as free publicity. Behind the scenes, Lugosi's hypnotic hand gestures and piercing stares became the stuff of legend. His paycheck, however, was shockingly small. Reports claim he earned only a few $1,000s, while the producers pocketed massive profits from its surprise success. Still, his performance cemented his reputation as one of horror's most haunting presences. Over time, White Zombie vanished into public domain obscurity, screened in scratchy prints on late-night television. But horror historians later reclaimed it, hailing it as a cornerstone of zombie cinema decades before George Romero redefined the genre. Today, its unsettling, quiet, and dreamlike horror still feel daring. It wasn't just about monsters, it was about control, identity, and the terrifying loss of humanity itself. The Mask of Fu Manchu, 1932. Few films from the pre-code era stirred outrage like MGM's The Mask of Fu Manchu. Advertised as an exotic horror thriller, it starred Boris Karloff as the villainous Dr. Fu Manchu, obsessed with acquiring the relics of Genghis Khan to launch a campaign of terror. Myrna Loy, later beloved for her sophisticated comedies, appeared here in a shocking role as his equally ruthless daughter. The film dripped with menace. Karloff's character presides over sadistic tortures, cruel experiments, and elaborate threats of conquest. Myrna Loy delivers lines that shocked audiences, reveling in her role as a cruel seductress. What horrified censors wasn't just the violence, it was the racial caricatures and the blatant inversion of morality. Some critics claimed the film encouraged chaos rather than condemning it. Behind the scenes, Myrna Loy later confessed she was embarrassed by the role, blaming MGM for coercing her into a part far outside her comfort zone. Karloff, however, leaned into the villainy, enjoying the chance to play something darker than Frankenstein's monster. Production was rushed, the script rewritten mid-shoot, and the results were messy but unforgettable. The backlash was swift. Advocacy groups accused the film of being racially inflammatory. Britain banned it for years. Even in the U.S., it faced heavy criticism, with some theaters pulling it after. Community protests. Yet, for others, its transgressive energy only added to the allure. It was dangerous cinema, a spectacle audiences weren't supposed to see. Though now viewed as deeply problematic, The Mask of Fu Manchu endures as a window into the wild freedom of the pre-code era. Its excess, its cruelty, and its reckless disregard for convention proved both its downfall and its strange immortality. The film reminds us that horror sometimes lies not just in monsters, but in the ways cinema mirrors the prejudices and fears of its age. Dr. X, 1932. Dr. X arrived at a time when studios were experimenting wildly, and it showed. Warner Brothers billed it as a horror mystery with a sensational hook. It was shot entirely in two-color Technicolor. The result was a bizarre blend of garish greens and reds that made its gruesome story even more surreal. The film follows a series of brutal murders committed under the glow of the full moon. Lionel Atwill plays Dr. Xavier, head of a medical institute where each of his colleagues may be the killer. To trap the murderer, Xavier stages a bizarre reenactment, complete with scientific experiments and psychological torture. The killer's unmasking, involving grotesque makeup and a twisted confession, stunned audiences. Censors were uneasy from the start. The plot included cannibalism, perverse medical science, and shocking violence. Newspapers reported that some states wanted it banned, and others forced edits. Audiences, however, were fascinated by its weird mix of horror and science. Some critics sneered at its ghastly novelty, but many admitted they couldn't look away. Behind the scenes, the use of Technicolor was expensive and cumbersome. The cameras were bulky, the lighting harsh, and actors sweated under the heat of the giant lamps. Fay Wray, who also starred in King Kong the following year, struggled with long hours in sweltering conditions. Warner executives nearly shelved the project, but released it anyway, hoping its shock value would draw crowds. It did. Dr. X became a hit, spawning a sequel. Though long overshadowed by Universal's classics, it has since been recognized as one of the strangest and boldest entries of its era. Its garish colors, grotesque imagery, and twisted science remain a reminder of how daring pre-code horror could be before the censors shut it down. The Most Dangerous Game, 1932, released the same year as King Kong and even filmed on some of the same sets. The Most Dangerous Game was a different kind of horror. Human, not supernatural. Starring Leslie Banks, Fay Wray, and Joel McCrea, it told the chilling tale of a shipwrecked hunter who washes up on an island, only to discover he's become prey for a sadistic aristocrat. Count Zaroff, played with unnerving charm by Banks, stalks humans for sport in his sprawling jungle estate. The premise, Man Hunting Man, was shocking in 1932. At a time when audiences expected vampires and ghouls, this film suggested the true monsters wore tuxedos. Censors squirmed at its violence, arrows piercing flesh, menacing hounds tearing at victims, and the sheer psychological dread of humans treated as game. Behind the scenes, production was a whirlwind. The film was shot at night while King Kong used the same sets during the day. Fay Wray recalled working exhausting double shifts, moving from screams of terror in the jungle to shrieks atop the Empire State Building. Though shorter and cheaper than Kong, it captured a primal fear. Critics were divided. Some praised its suspense and twisted originality. Others called it gruesome and unfit for family audiences. In Britain, it faced cuts for excessive brutality. But word of mouth spread, and it became a sleeper hit. Its legacy was massive. The story of humans hunted for sport has been retold countless times, from the Hunger Games to modern thrillers. Yet none carried the raw, pre-code edge of the original. In its eerie silence, with the jungle closing in, the most dangerous game asked a terrifying question. When stripped of civilization, what separates hunter from hunted? The Black Cat, 1934. By 1934, the Hays Code was already tightening, but the Black Cat slipped through with imagery so shocking it remains one of the darkest films Universal ever released. It paired two horror legends, Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff, in a tale of obsession, torture, and satanic overtones. The story begins with a newlywed couple stranded in Hungary, taken in by a brooding psychiatrist, Lugosi. Soon they encounter Karloff as a satanic architect who has built his home atop a mass grave. What follows is a battle of wills between the two men, punctuated by whispered rituals, psychological cruelty, and hints of necrophilia that censors somehow missed. The film's most infamous sequence showed Lugosi skinning Karloff alive, off-screen but unmistakably implied. Audiences recoiled, some theaters banned it outright, while others demanded edits. Critics were aghast, calling it indescribably repulsive. Even within Universal, executives feared they had gone too far. Behind the scenes, director Edgar G. Ulmer clashed with the studio over his surreal style. His use of sharp architecture, shadows, and expressionist sets made the film dreamlike, almost nightmarish. Ulmer was effectively blacklisted afterward, reduced to working on Poverty Row films despite his talent. For years, The Black Cat was nearly buried, dismissed as too lurid. But horror fans later reclaimed it as a masterpiece, perhaps the most daring of Universal's early horrors. Its clash of titans, Lugosi and Karloff, remains unforgettable, and its surreal dread showed just how far pre-code cinema could push before censorship slammed shut. In its silence, in its shadows, The Black Cat whispered horrors audiences weren't supposed to hear. And perhaps that's why it lingers. Mystery of the Wax. Museum, 1933. Before Vincent Price made wax museums infamous, there was Michael Curtis's Mystery of the Wax Museum. Shot in the same strange two-color Technicolor process as Dr. X, it told the story of a sculptor disfigured in a fire who rebuilds his museum, with wax figures created from corpses. Lionel Atwill delivered a chilling performance as Ivan Igor, the obsessed artist hiding a monstrous secret. Fay Wray, once again the scream queen of the era, plays the reporter who uncovers his grisly truth. The film blended horror with snappy pre-code dialogue, making it both shocking and oddly modern. The controversy came from its graphic suggestion of murder and mutilation. Wax figures were revealed to be preserved bodies, their eyes staring blankly beneath glossy shells. Some censors demanded cuts, arguing it was too grotesque for audiences. In England, objections were raised over its morbid excess. Behind the scenes, Curtis was ruthless. His sets were sweltering under the blazing Technicolor lights, and Fay Wray fainted more than once. Atwill, swaddled in heavy makeup, endured long hours under hot lamps. Warner Brothers executives hesitated, fearing its blend of horror and sensationalism would alienate viewers. But when it premiered, audiences flocked. Critics were divided. Some praised its style, others condemned it as tasteless. Over time, the film was nearly lost, surviving only in battered prints until a full restoration revealed its strange, garish beauty. Today, it stands as a direct ancestor of the 1953 remake House of Wax. Mystery of the Wax Museum remains a haunting reminder. Beauty can conceal horror, and sometimes the most lifelike faces hide the deadliest secrets. The Vampire Bat, 1933. The Vampire Bat arrived during Hollywood's pre-code horror boom, produced cheaply, but with a cast that included Fay Wray, Lionel Atwill, and Melvyn Douglas. Marketed as a shocking vampire tale, it blurred the line between supernatural fear and scientific dread. The story begins in a small German village plagued by mysterious deaths. The townsfolk believe a vampire is to blame, but as suspicion grows, it becomes clear that the true horror lies not in fangs, but in science. Atwill plays Dr. von Niemann, a physician experimenting with blood transfusions in sinister ways. The real terror comes when he is revealed as the murderer, using human lives for his experiments. Audiences were disturbed not just by the violence, but by the moral ambiguity. Unlike Dracula's Gothic fantasy, the vampire bat suggested evil could hide in rational science itself. Censors in several states objected to its repellent imagery and demanded cuts, particularly of scenes showing pale corpses drained of blood. Behind the scenes, the film was shot in less than 2 weeks, reusing sets from Frankenstein and The Old Dark House. Despite its shoestring budget, its atmosphere was chilling. Fay Wray once again found herself typecast as the imperiled heroine, shrieking in terror while Atwill oozed menace. While not a critical hit, it became a staple of double bills and horror matinees, later rediscovered on television in the 1950s. Its legacy lies in its daring fusion of vampire myth with scientific experimentation, a theme horror would return to again and again. In the end, the vampire bat proved that horror didn't need capes and castles. Sometimes the most terrifying monster was the trusted doctor behind the door. The Old Dark House, 1932. Directed by James Whale, fresh off Frankenstein, The Old Dark House was unlike anything audiences expected. Part horror, part black comedy, it delivered a gothic storm of madness that was too strange for its time, but later celebrated as a cult classic. The plot follows stranded travelers seeking shelter from a storm, only to find themselves trapped in a crumbling mansion with a family of eccentrics and killers. Ernest Thesiger plays the effete, sinister Horace Femme, while Boris Karloff delivers one of his most terrifying roles as the mute, violent butler, Morgan. What disturbed audiences wasn't only the violence but the perversity of the family itself. The Femmes were decadent, deranged, and hinted at unspoken depravity. The dialogue dripped with dark humor that unsettled critics who couldn't decide if it was comedy or horror. In Britain, some censors bristled at its irreverence toward religion and family. Behind the scenes, James Whale reveled in mocking conventions. He mixed Gothic horror tropes with sardonic wit, confusing MGM executives who expected a straightforward chiller. Karloff, cast as the monstrous butler, terrified audiences with his hulking presence, while Thesiger became iconic for his campy, unsettling performance. At the time, reviews were lukewarm, and the film faded quickly. For years, it was considered lost until rediscovered in the 1960s when cult audiences embraced its bizarre energy. Today, it is regarded as one of Whale's masterpieces, a blend of menace and satire that feels decades ahead of its time. The Old Dark House reminds us that true horror isn't only in monsters, it's in the unsettling laughter that echoes when terror and absurdity collide. Mad Love, 1935. Released just before the Hays Code tightened its grip, Mad Love was MGM's shocking remake of the French classic The Hands of Orlac. Starring Peter Lorre in his American debut, it blended obsession, body horror, and psychological breakdown in ways audiences weren't prepared for. The story follows Dr. Gogol, a surgeon infatuated with an actress who doesn't return his love. When her pianist husband is maimed in a train accident, Gogol secretly grafts a murderer's hands onto him. The transplanted limbs begin to exhibit violent tendencies, driving the pianist toward madness. Meanwhile, Gogol's own obsession curdles into insanity. Censors recoiled at the implications. Grotesque surgeries, psychological torture, and hints of necrophilia. In Britain, it faced bans, and in America, critics complained of its sickening morbidity. Some newspapers refused to advertise it, fearing backlash from readers. Behind the scenes, Peter Lorre shaved his head and delivered one of the creepiest performances of the pre-code era. Soft-spoken, obsessive, and chillingly unhinged. MGM executives worried his intensity would alienate audiences, and indeed, the film underperformed financially. But horror historians now see it as a landmark in psychological horror, bridging Gothic spectacle with the darker, more internal fears of obsession and madness. For decades, Mad Love was overshadowed by Universal's monsters, but its influence seeped quietly into cinema. From Eyes Without a Face to David Cronenberg's body horror, the DNA of Mad Love persists. Its legacy is unsettling, a reminder that love twisted into obsession can become the most terrifying horror of all. The pre-code era was short, but its shadows linger. These films dared to explore cruelty, obsession, and taboo before Hollywood censors locked the doors. Many were banned, forgotten, or butchered, yet they survive as warnings and wonders. Which of these forbidden horrors haunts you the most? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more hidden cinema.